And the first question we received is, please explain the connection between the Federal Reserve System and America's foreign policy of foreign intervention. Richard, you want to go first? Is it on? Try it. Where's the button? Well, talking to it.
Hello? Hello? Oh, yes, it is working. Okay. The connection that, at least one level of the connection that one can draw between the Federal Reserve and American foreign intervention is the capacity of the United States government to draw upon a source of wealth. If the United States had to run a balanced budget and therefore had to go to the American people and immediately and directly say, if we want to do policy X, this is the estimated cost. Therefore, to do this policy X, we must increase taxes by a certain dollar amount, and this is going to be the incidence of the taxes. That's just the economist lingo, is who pays it and how much. People would therefore know the cost of what government activities involve. This applies to foreign policy as well. If the United States government wants to fight a foreign war, you tell the American citizens what you estimate is going to be the charge, and therefore the increase in the taxes and upon whom in what amounts. But they don't have to do that. That's the miracle of deficit spending. The government borrows a sum of money that represents the excess of its spending over what it takes in taxes, and that burden does not appear directly to the American taxpayer. It is as if wealth has been created for the government to spend out of thin air. Think of it this way. Suppose that someone says to you, tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you $100 worth of goodies, but I'm only going to charge you $60 or $70 for it. Isn't that a bargain? Who's going to turn down $100 of desirable stuff and only be charged $60 or $70? Right? That's like when somebody says, on sale, 25% off. But the fact is, the government has to do one of two things. If it's going to spend 100 but only tax people 70, it has to go into the financial market and borrow the other $30. Now that can be financed in one of two ways. It means the government is now going to be taking part, siphoning off part of the savings of the society and spend that savings on those programs, as opposed to that $30 being available to fund and support private sector investment activities. That's, in a sense, clear. Interest rates will rise because government has increased the demand to borrow in financial markets, or the Federal Reserve can come in. And the Federal Reserve can do what is, again, in the jargon of the economist, monetize the debt. That's nothing more than saying that the Federal Reserve increases the money supply to cover the number of dollars the government wants to borrow. Now, in the short run, it seems that, well, we're not crowding out private investment. We're not increasing the tax burden on the American taxpayer. It's just somehow out of thin air, and then the government just spends this extra money. Now, when the government can do that on domestic programs, it's hard enough to see it. But when the government is also doing this in foreign policy, it again seems as if the government can undertake more military spending, more foreign adventurism, than the taxpayer understands is the real cost and the burden. I would suggest that if the government said, we're in Afghanistan, we're in Iraq, we're in Syria, we're having bases in countries X, Y, and Z, and here is the real price tag that has to be paid here and now on an annual basis to cover this plus everything else the government is spending on domestically, a lot more Americans would be suspicious and resistant of it. But the central bank enables the government to create an illusion of guns and butter, as the old Vietnam War phrase used to say, because the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air to cover all that government deficit spending.
Yeah.
I would just add very briefly to what Professor said, which I thought was great, would be to also keep in mind the psychological impact of no-cost wars. We understand the monetary impact of no-cost wars, but psychologically, what does it do to the American people? I think it makes them more inclined toward the use of aggressive force to solve problems. As Nicholas Taleb has written and is famous for, particularly in his most recent book, they have no skin in the game. We seldom visit, we seldom see in front of us the consequences of an aggressive foreign policy. You may know a soldier, someone knows the next soldier, but you don't see on the day-to-day basis what people in, for example, Fallujah or Aleppo see. So the psychological impact, Dr. Paul puts it very well, you subsidize something, you get more of it. The Federal Reserve subsidizes war, and so we see much more war and much more acceptance of the concept that problems overseas are best solved by the use of force.
Yeah, I'll amplify what you guys have said about just by pointing to the genius of our American ancestors. I mean, they knew this was going to happen. There was widespread antipathy toward calling the federal government into existence with the Constitution. I mean, the people have been operating under the Articles of Confederation for some 13 years. Under the Articles, the federal government didn't even have the power to tax. And so when the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia, everybody thought, oh, well, they're just going to modify the Articles. And they come out with this newfangled federal government idea. And people were very, very suspicious. No, you're going to end up with a government that involves us in wars, that's going to debauch our currency, that's going to kill us, that's going to torture us, like the Tower of London, you know, all the stuff they lived under with the British Empire when they were British citizens. And so they finally went along with the deal as long as the Bill of Rights was passed to try to stop this kind of thing. But there was no income tax. So they knew that there was no way the federal government had the money to get involved in all these wars. And there was no Federal Reserve System. There was no central bank to do what Richard Daniff said, is that, you know, finance the borrowing that inevitably goes into paying for these wars. We're often taught that the gold standard was paper money backed by gold. That's not the case at all. It was gold and silver coins were the official money. You see this in the Constitution, that the states are prohibited from making anything but gold and silver coin legal tender. Now, the federal government borrowed money, but the federal government was not given the power to make paper money. Everybody understood that the official money was gold and silver coins, and that the bonds they issued and the bills they issued were promises to pay that real money. Well, that terribly constricted their power to wage these wars and engage in empire, because you can't print gold and silver coins. And so they had no ability, very little ability, through no income taxation, you can't raise a lot of money, and through the inability to just print the money to finance the deficit, as Richard pointed out. Okay, second question. Interesting. Okay, this is about America's relationship with Russia. That she says that the diatribes against Russia occur daily, and people are being indoctrinated in the anti-Russia attitudes, and everybody's expected to have this anti-Russia mindset. And she wants to know, how can the Ron Paul Institute and the Future Freedom Foundation, and really, how can Americans counter this fear-mongering about Russia with respect to America's foreign policy? You want to go first, Dan?
Yeah, sure. Well, it is probably worse than the McCarthyist era in the U.S. right now, where people are attacked. There are people who attack us regularly because we will appear on RT. It's kind of funny. I do go on RT fairly frequently when I have time. And I've also been on a few of the mainstream media shows. On RT, I've never been asked what I'm going to say. In fact, several times I've said, look, I know the Russian government's position on this, and I think it's wrong, and I'm going to say it if you have me on. They say that's fine. Whereas when, for example, I've been interviewed by Canadian radio, pre-interviewed by Sky, it was a half an hour long pre-interview. Then they called back the next day and said, we've decided not to do that segment. So I tell them that it's not who gives us the platform. It's just that we are allowed to have a platform to talk about non-interventionism, to talk about peace and prosperity with Russia. The Bolsheviks had a saying, tell us who likes you and we'll tell you who you are, what you are. And that's really what has come back. It's a Bolshevist mentality here that is that is extremely dangerous in our society. It is so, if you're on Twitter and you see the kinds of things that are being said, the kinds of things that are being blamed on Russia, it's just mind-boggling. You feel you're in some sort of a time warp, or even worse than a time warp.
Well, let's make some distinctions here. The Russian government under Vladimir Putin is an authoritarian regime that is corrupt, violent, manipulative, and power-lusting. So there's no need to be apologistic for them domestically. And the Putin government, like most governments around the world that have certain size and resources at their disposal, want to be a player on the world. So Putin and the Russian government have this desire to restore Russia as a national global player, have influence again, overcome what they view as the humiliation of having lost the Cold War and having to give up their empire. So they have played their games in Crimea, in the Ukraine. They've intervened to maintain their naval bases in Syria, which they had from the Soviet era. They have these other alliances for pragmatic purposes with Iran and so on. And they view that the United States and Europe played tricks on them. And one of the tricks is that when the Soviet Union was giving up its Eastern Bloc empire, the understanding is that NATO would not expand into Eastern Europe. That it would sort of be, the Soviets would be gone and Russia would not influence it then. But at the same time, the NATO would not move east. Well, they did. And since politicians and nation states and bureaucrats tend to be paranoid, regardless of what nation you're talking about, the Russians view that this was cheated on them. Now, as a result of all of this, the Russians have responded in their own statist and interventionist, imperialistic ways, as I just said. This plays into the hands of those in America who, at different levels of consciousness, I suppose, in government, believe that it is necessary and useful to have a foreign enemy. I mean, how do you justify the defense budget? How do you justify the national security state? How do you justify the size of a global military presence if you do not have enemies to which the U.S. has to serve as, quote, a bulwark against? And so as a result of this, Russia has become a boogeyman. And particularly since Putin is such a despicable authoritarian individual, it makes it easier. When the guy you're propping up as your straw man himself is a monster, it makes it easier for him to be a straw man for your domestic purposes. Given this, it now serves the political purposes of a lot of people in the United States, the Democrats. The Democrats have not accepted that Hillary lost. This was a shock for them. Now, most people know that there are several stages of grieving. First denial, then anger, then you go through several others, and finally you reach acceptance. They're still in denial and anger. They can't get beyond this. So they have, well, how could we have not stayed in power? It must be the Russians. And it also plays upon their base and everything else, so they need the Russian boogeyman. On the other hand, other than Trump, for his own reasons, it serves the purpose of a lot of neocons and people in the military to say that Russia is a boogeyman, along with China and its own military buildup, to say that the Russians are aggressive, we have to be a bulwark against them in various parts of the world. And this is the problem we have. It serves the political agendas and purposes of both political parties, of bureaucracy, and it plays well in the media. How do you get people to watch CNN and Fox 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? By having boogeymen and crises, and so this just plays into it. And this is what that Russia plays in this whole area. If it wasn't Putin, in my opinion, it would be some other nation. More logically, if Putin was a pussycat, both domestically and in foreign affairs, it would be President Xi of China and the Chinese. I mean, they're the ones who are undertaking this aggressive action that Congressman Sanford pointed out in Southeast Asia, and national Chinese greatness and so on. It would just be the Chinese who would be the bigger boogeyman. It just serves domestic purposes.
If I could just gently disagree with the professor on a number of points. You mentioned Ukraine in the context of Russian expansionism, whereas in fact it was a U.S. regime change policy in Ukraine that started the conflict. How do we know that? Well, the U.S. government told us itself. Victoria Nuland was caught on tape talking about how we're going to overthrow the government, talking about who we're going to put in position. And so when you have a situation like that, it leads to reactions. One of the reactions was Crimea, which is 90% Russian. When all of a sudden you have a US-inspired coup in Ukraine that turns the country virulently anti-Russian, particularly in the Donbass to the east, where Russian is spoken by about 98% of the population, you have Crimea, which is 90% Russian, having a reaction. If the US is going to foment a coup in Ukraine that is anti-Russian, we're going to jump for the lifeboats. And so what they did is they held a referendum where the people voted to rejoin Russia, which they had been part of for centuries. So I think you're missing the boat a little bit on that, with all due respect. The other thing is, this is just a matter of personal preference, but I don't, as I mentioned in my speech, like to use the adoption of neocon interventionist language, talking about foreign leaders as despicable monsters, because it leads toward an aggressive perspective, and it leads toward the acceptance of intervention toward the country. So I don't mean to any offense, but...
if I may, I refuse to follow a line that would say Hitler and Stalin were pussycats. I don't want to call them monsters, because it might create a bad impression in America. Okay. The other thing is, yes, the United States played its own game in Ukraine. That's true. That doesn't justify the Russians to take over Crimea. That would be like saying, well, you know, the Russians come into some country in Central America, so that would justify the United States to militarily intervene in that country. No, it would. I think most libertarians would be horrified if the United States then did that merely because the Russians were to play some similar game in a Central American country. It's symmetrical. If the United States plays its own manipulative game in Ukraine, that's not a justification for the Russians to do this. And the election in Crimea was not a free and fair election.
How do you know that?
It was not a free and fair election. The Russians the Russians are manipulators and power lusters. The government of Russia is...
You just said the Russians are manipulative, just like, what's his name?
Okay.
The head of the CIA.
Okay. Okay. When you say the Russians in this context, it's like talking about the Americans or the French or the Germans. What you mean is the government and those who run the government. It's like referring to America or Washington. You're referring to the political establishment. I'm not making a racist statement, and it is a misrepresentation of all common sense language in talking about these matters to express it that way. Putin's government kills dissidents. Putin's government attempts to manipulate other countries. Putin's government seized the seized Crimea and manipulated election. Did the Ukrainians in Crimea have a choice? Did the Tatars in Crimea have a choice? No. They did not vote for it.
4 years later, they're very happy in Crimea.
All right,
Okay.
All right, let me add.
Yes.
Please be respectful to the speakers.
Let me
Yes, and they were happy Jews in Theresienstadt.
Let me just put things in an overall generalized context. Any national security state, y'all have heard me describe what a national security state is. The coin of the realm of any national security state is fear. You have to keep people afraid. I mean, from the very beginning, President Truman, when he was thinking in terms of converting the federal government to a national security state, he was told, you've got to scare the hell out of the American people to get this through, because the Americans are not going to easily give up their republic. And they did. the fear was of the Soviet Union, the communist threat. They're coming to get us. The dominoes are going to fall. And by the way, national security states over there do the same thing. In North Korea, one of the main things they use to maintain their grip on power is the threat of a U.S. attack, which in their minds is a very real possibility, especially after Iraq and all the things that happened with Cuba during the Cold War, calling North Korea part of the axis of evil. That fear, then people say, oh, take away our liberties, centralize power. The same thing in Cuba, that the threat of a U.S. invasion again, we have to centralize power. So that's what goes on here as well, is that they always need official enemies. Fear is the coin of the realm. So when they lost the Soviet Union, I'm not convinced they really wanted to lose the Soviet Union. I think this anti-Russia mentality and mindset is really a continuation of that Cold War mindset. The only difference is that they can't say, oh, the commies are coming to get us, the Reds are coming to get us. It's the Russians. Or if it's not Russians, it's the terrorists. If it's not the terrorists, it's ISIS. If it's not ISIS, it's Saddam Hussein, who they call the new Hitler. Or it's the illegal aliens, or it's the drug dealers. Whatever it is, that's what they have to do. They have to keep people afraid in order to maintain their existence and their justification for existing. Okay, next question. Okay, recent polling suggests a majority of Americans across the political spectrum are growing increasingly weary of open-ended military interventions abroad. How do we work to effectively separate the concepts of patriotism from militarism and the idea that being opposed to the next war is somehow analogous to being soft on terrorism, unpatriotic, or, quote, isolationist? Dan?
What we try to do on the Liberty Report, and it's very difficult, it's a real challenge because there is the concept that militarism equals patriotism. And if you think about it, it's pretty illogical because if you really are a patriot, if you really want America to be strong and be successful, why would you endorse a policy that's guaranteed to weaken the country? Why would you endorse a policy that sends the yearly military budget is over $1 trillion when you add up all the components of the national security state, as Bumper so rightly terms it? Why would you endorse something that will make us weaker, that will, as Dr. Paul says, eventually lead to a complete economic breakdown when we are on our backs, when we are at the mercy of our adversaries overseas? We're not a strong nation, and that is coming. We cannot continue to maintain a military budget that's equal to the next 7, 8, or 9 countries combined. It's literally impossible to do. And if you study people like Chuck Spinney and the experts at military procurement reform, you'd understand that not only can we not sustain that spending, the money, because of the way weapon systems are front-loaded, and it's too long to get into now, but we're actually getting worse quality weapon systems because of the way that weapons are being procured. That's why we have the F-35 that cannot fly with a $200,000 helmet that can't fly. 50% currently right now, 50% of the F-35s are not capable of flying, the most expensive aircraft in the history of the world. So we're not getting a better product. We're getting a worse product, and it's costing us more. That will weaken us. That is the first thing, is to emphasize that patriotism costs the destruction of America through overspending. The other, I would just say, to reaffirm once again, to reject the demands of the neocons and interventionists, that you subscribe to the idea of demonizing the Hitler of the week, because that sets the stage for interventions. That sets the stage for us to continue our murderous and self-destructive foreign policy.
One of the most sort of rhetorical and content difficulties is how to reestablish or improve the use and the meaning of the word patriotism because of its misuse and abuse and manipulation by most governments around the world for their own respective purposes, including the United States. What is a patriot? Now, to me, and I can only speak for myself, as a classical liberal, as a libertarian, I would consider a patriot of freedom is one who grounds his belief that the good society is a society of individual liberty, free markets, and voluntary association. And that one feels a loyalty to that country and to defend it, where those rights and free and voluntary relationships are respected, and the government limits itself to securing those liberties and freedoms, as I referred to in my own talk earlier. The problem is that patriotism is, as often said, is the last refuge of a scoundrel. You wrap yourself in the flag, you say that this is in the national interest, this serves the needs of the country, and you then challenge anyone who dissents from this. Oh, you don't love America, you're unpatriotic, you want to sell out to some boogeyman abroad, and so on. And it's a very delicate balance. I believe that historically there are legitimate meanings and understandings of patriotism, the patriot of a free society and the principles of freedom. But unfortunately, like the word liberal, it has been so twisted and bastardized for political and ideological purposes of those not just on the left, but often on the left, that it's a difficult task to redefine it and contextualize it in a way that's either not going to be understood or will again be open to manipulation and abuse.
Yeah, I agree with both of what they said. I'd like to add that I think a core problem here is that all too many people conflate the government and the country. In their minds, the federal government is America. So that if you criticize the federal government, you hate America, you're attacking your country. When actually these are two separate entities. The country and the government are two separate entities. We see this phenomenon reflected by the Bill of Rights, which, by the way, does not give us rights at all. If you look at it really carefully, you'll see it doesn't give us rights. Instead, it protects the country from the federal government, protects our rights from the federal government. Now, to me, the patriot is the person that stands for what is right, even or especially when the government is in the wrong. That's what takes the courage. You know, it doesn't take any courage, as far as I'm concerned, to support whatever the government does. The courage comes from people in the private sector that says, what you're doing is wrong, especially when the government can retaliate by doing bad things, killing the dissident, IRS audited the dissident, whatever. That's the true patriot. I mean, when you look at people that signed the Declaration of Independence, we look at them as patriots, but they were British citizens. We often forget that. They were not American citizens. They were British citizens. They took on their own government and said, what you're doing here is wrong. The best example of this dichotomy, in my opinion, involves a group called the White Rose. And I wrote an essay on this that I invite you to read. I think it's my favorite essay I've ever written in the 29 years I've been doing this. It's called The White Rose, A Lesson in Dissent. And it was republished in a magazine, in a book for high school students about the Holocaust. That the Germans had the same position on patriotism as many Americans. That when the war starts, you support your government. You know, the time for debate is over. You got to rally to the troops. You got to support the troops. And that's pretty much the concept that a lot of Americans hold. That, oh, we're at war now. You got to support the government. Certainly that took place after the Iraq War started. Well, in Nazi Germany, there was a group of college students called the White Rose. They were led by a brother and sister called Hans and Sophie Scholl, who started publishing essays contrary to the Nazi regime. They were secret, they were surreptitious. This was about in 1943, and they were distributing them secretly. Now, they were caught. They were given a trial within 3 days, a quote trial. If you want to see a fantastic movie, go rent Sophie Scholl, The Final Days, which really depicts what happened at the trial, because they found all the documents later on. And how this girl, this young woman, Sophie Scholl, stands up to these Nazi tyrants on the court. And you know, they considered her a traitor. They executed her and her brother. They were like 21, 22 years old. Along with their friends, they executed them because they were traitors. Well, we look back on this, and the German people, by the way, look back on it and say, they were the patriots. They were the ones taking the stand for what was right. And I think that's what patriotism is really all about. standing for what's right, standing for what's moral, especially when your government's moving in the opposite direction. Okay. Okay. This guy's soon to be a commissioned officer in our nation's military. What type of outlook mentality should I have going in to the military? Richie, you want to go first or last?
It is a difficult time, if one holds classical liberal or libertarian views, for a person to serve in the military. As I said, a free society and its preservation requires a constitutionally limited government. And such a constitutionally limited government must involve the government's ability to undertake a legitimate and rightful national defense against any existing or imminent aggressive threat from another nation. So certainly in the philosophy of freedom, there is a right of self-defense, and the collective version of that is the limited constitutional government. So to serve in such a military for such preservations of freedom is both legitimate and in those circumstances, I would even say honorable. Just as the policemen or the firemen who properly and legitimately within the law do their duties. But it creates a conflict of conscience sometimes in our current situation, that you sign into the military and you agree to follow orders, though even the military has its own code of military justice that even specifies when it is legitimate not to obey certain orders in certain circumstances. But even if there's not such a violation in the Code of Military Justice, you may very well be required to go into harm's way and to follow orders that exceed the legitimate defense actions of the United States government as understood by a friend of freedom. And that's a decision of conscience that only that person can make. And I don't know how else to answer that.
That's a very difficult question to answer, and I struggle like Professor Ebeling does as well. I had a very good friend, John Sharp, who was a commander in the U.S. Navy. He graduated at the top of his class at the U.S. Naval Academy. And when the Iraq War started, or was started in 2003, he's also a publisher. And he published a series of essays under the title Neocon 1 and 2. Very important books, and essentially one of them featured great anti-war writers on the left and right, Pat Buchanan, Sam Francis, and many others, Alex Coburn and so many others. And the other book was a philosophical book, and it dealt with Aquinas and St. Augustine and about the concept of just war. The implication of the two books, of course, was that the Iraq War did not meet the justification, did not meet the requirements to be considered a just war. And the U.S. Navy threw everything it could at him. He was brought up on charges. His naval career was destroyed. He was accused of all sorts of horrific, grotesque things that he did not do. Essentially, a very bright young military officer's career was destroyed because of it. So it is a very delicate thing. I will say that Commander Sharp's story had a silver lining, because after years and years in the wilderness of having his career destroyed and of living with, I think, his 8 children on a shoestring, he spent his entire time studying military law and studying law in general. He fought his own case. He fought back against them, and in fact actually was victorious just this past year. Not only did he have all of his back pay, but all of the promotions that he was due that he had not gotten. So there's a silver lining, but what an awful sacrifice to make, to stand by your principles, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone.
Yeah, I agree with both of them. I think going into the military today is the most difficult thing for any individual because of this problem of conscience. And I speak as a former infantry officer, former graduate of the Virginia Military Institute. If your military is limited to defense, like the Swiss military is, then there's not a problem. You're serving your country to defend your country in case that invasion ever comes, and nobody ever invades the Swiss because they know it'd be by like swallowing a porcupine, and nobody would invade the United States if the military was here just defending the country. But that's not what's happening. The military is being sent abroad to kill people, none of whom have ever attacked the United States. If you count up all the people that the U.S. forces, U.S. soldiers have killed in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and anywhere else, none of them have initiated violence against the United States. The United States has been the initiator of the violence. Even 9/11 was retaliatory violence for what had already gone on before. So the soldier is put into a very interesting position of kill or be killed. And that is problematic. I ran this by a Catholic priest friend of mine after the invasion of Iraq started. He's a libertarian. And he was a good friend of mine. And I said, if I were in that position, being sent to Iraq, what is my duty as a Catholic? And he says, you can't kill anybody over there. That and I said, but wait a minute, they're shooting at you. He says, you are the aggressor. You, under God's law, do not have the right to kill anybody when you're the aggressor. It's like a burglar of a home. You know, the burglar goes into the home and the homeowner shoots at him, and the burglar shoots back and says, I was only defending myself. Well, it's the same thing in these foreign escapades. The person's put in the position of kill or be killed, and if he's religiously inclined, he's in a very difficult position because he has to decide, should I kill or be killed when I know there's theological ramifications here? And this is another reason why we need to dismantle this whole thing. This is never something you should put your soldiers into, this type of moral predicament. So it's an abuse of your armed forces to do this. Another good reason for dismantling this interventionist foreign policy.
If I can just add one more thought to this. Maybe some of you are familiar with Leonard E. Reed. He was the founder and longtime first president of the Foundation for Economic Education, FEE. During the Korean War, I think it was 1951, he wrote an essay called Conscience on the Battlefield. He lost a lot of support because of this essay. You know, it's a lot of financial support from donors. But he felt it was a matter of conscience himself to write this. It is a young American soldier dying in Korea. And as he's dying, he's asking himself the questions, why has my government sent me here? Why have I been put in the position of having to shoot and kill people who have not attacked me, my family, or my country? And why have I been in the position to now slowly seeing the life drain from me? Why has my government put me in the position of myself being one of the victims? And this raises the whole issue of what is a military for? What legitimate functions can the government perform in putting young men in harm's way and put them in the horrifying predicament of having maybe to kill others to preserve their own life because being put into a position that has nothing to do with freedom per se. These are difficult issues, but I think that sometimes to get at the truth and sort of sort out what's right and wrong and what needs to be done, difficult questions have to be asked and answered.
Yeah, and the other thing is, if you're an officer, your mission is to keep your men safe. Don't go off on any heroic missions to, you're spreading democracy or you're doing this or doing that. Your mission as an officer is, especially in these foreign escapades, these imperialist, interventionist escapades, you keep your men safe and you bring back everybody alive and don't take any risks that involve their lives or their safety. Okay, next question, and we got about 7 more minutes, so this is probably the last one. I believe our best chance for regaining our individual freedom comes from the inevitable economic reality that will result from the government's spending policies. Given the strength of the present welfare state and warfare state, do you think there is a realistic chance that we can vote ourselves free? Richard?
Okay. Nothing is inevitable. Nothing is deterministically set in stone. You can go through a very number of periods of history and say, look, we're on this tragic path. There's no way out. It's the end of freedom. It's the end of democracy. It's this, that, and the other. And invariably, it has not always been as disastrous as seemed while living through it. Now, sometimes it is disastrous, but it doesn't have to be. The fact is that it is not set in stone that entitlement programs cannot be changed. It's only called entitlement to create the false impression that it cannot be modified. It's mandatory, as it says. Discretionary spending, mandatory spending. It's only mandatory for as long as the legislation is either repealed or radically modified. It requires a sea change in the thinking and attitudes of the American people. Often it requires a crisis for people to ask themselves, am I, and in this sense of policy, are we as a country on the right road? Or do we need to backtrack and get on a better road? What's important is that we are facing a fiscal crisis. And while defense spending and military overreach, as the U.S. government has been undertaking, is a crucial element of it, the fact is what is eating us alive fiscally with taxes and with the deficits and the growing debt is domestic entitlement spending. If you add up Social Security and Medicare and all of the programs under those two headings, plus the interest that we currently pay on the national debt, that eats up approximately 40% of the U.S. government's budget deficit. And that's anticipated to just grow because of the mandatory spending obligations under Social Security and Medicare under current legislation. That is what has to be changed. These are very appealing programs. Oh, the government is going to give me retirement money. The government is going to take care of my health care. And of course, this is pandered and played to from everybody from Hillary Clinton to Bernie Sanders to, unfortunately, too many Republicans. But the fact is that it's not set in stone. It is becoming a more fiscal crisis situation with each passing year, particularly as the annual deficits are going to become closer and then reaching $1 trillion a year again, as in the early years of the Obama administration. And it may be a wake-up call for people to ask themselves, what kind of future do I want for myself and my children and my grandchildren, and the threat that it therefore holds for the country as a whole and its economic and political future.
Okay, let me go second, and then I'll let Dan wrap the whole conference up. Yeah, I agree with that. Nothing's inevitable. I mean, if it were inevitable, we'd still have a society with none of this stuff that existed throughout the 1800s. But the interventionists, the socialists, through the power of their bad ideas, were able to shift the course of the country. Well, if they could shift it in a bad direction, we can shift it in a good direction. And that's the power of ideas on liberty. That's why we're here. The adherence to principles. We can lead the world out of this morass, but it takes that commitment of a people that want to be free. And I think one of the most important questions that every one of us should be asking across America: what is the role of government, the legitimate role of government in a free society? Should it be to take money from Peter to give it to Paul? Should it be to police the world? Should it be to try to control regimes around the world, support brutal dictatorships? And I would suggest that if enough Americans reach the right answers to that, we're going to see major, monumental change in a positive direction, in the direction of peace and freedom, prosperity and harmony. So let me take this opportunity, and then I'll pass it over to Dan. Thank you again for coming. Thank you for your great support, those of you that support us. We would love to have your support, those of you that are just learning about FFF. Your donations, they help fund these kind of programs in other parts of the country. And take a look at what we do at fff.org. And if you like it and you like our style, even if you don't agree with everything we do, we would love to have your support. So, Dan, it's been a great honor to do this with you guys. It's exciting. I hope we can do it again.
It's been an absolute thrill working with one of my heroes. I would just add to what you said, Bumper, and you kind of said what I wanted to say. But I would just echo Dr. Paul, what he always says: we don't need a majority. That's why we shouldn't get discouraged. We don't need a majority. We don't need 50% plus one person to endorse our views. There's actually strength. This is one area where Lenin and the Bolsheviks were right. There is strength in being a minority if it's an intellectually cohesive minority. Once the idea is ready, it will be impossible to stop. So that's why we're planting seeds as we go. And these are the seeds that we're planting, and thanks all of you to continue with the metaphor, helping us nurture these seeds. And that's what you'll do when you leave. You'll talk to people, you'll talk to friends and family members, and that will continue it. So that's why we're so grateful to have you take time out of your day to join us, to be part of what we're trying to do. And again, as to echo what Jacob said, if you do support what the Ron Paul Institute does and what FFF does, we have a little donation coupon in there that tells you how to help us continue doing what we do. We have a conference coming up in August. I'll be sending an email to anyone who's registered. When we get the date, it'll be our annual Washington, D.C. conference. We've already got some really nifty speakers lined up, but I can't say who yet. But subscribe to our YouTube channel, Ron Paul Liberty Report. Read our website, ronpaulinstitute.org. Follow what we do. Follow us on Twitter, etc. And thank you very much for joining us.